was the year 1994.
1994 was the year that saw a very big change in the console market. A change that would shake the industry to its core, and the ramifications of that are still felt over 30 years later. And that is a very good place to start with this video, so here we go. The Sony PlayStation. The 1990s in the gaming market were largely predicated on the great console 16-bit war between SEGA and Nintendo. The Sega Mega Drive / Genesis was giving the Super Nintendo a run for its money, with the console market firmly divided between the two. It looked as if it was destined to be these two powerhouses that would slug it out in the games market for generations to come, and no one else would come close. That is until Sony. Now here is a little history lesson. Now Sony had a working history with Nintendo, and they produced the SPC 700 sound processor on the Super Nintendo, courtesy of Sony executive Ken Kutaragi, who had become fascinated with working together with Nintendo after his daughter's love of playing on the Super Famicom. Sony were interested in breaking into the rapidly growing video game industry and began a working relationship with Nintendo. An initial agreement between the two companies was about producing a CD-ROM drive add-on. Sony had also planned to develop a SNES-compatible Sony-branded console. This was intended to be more of a home entertainment system, playing both Super Nintendo cartridges and a new CD format named the Super Disc. This was tentatively called the PlayStation. However, under the agreements, Sony would be the biggest beneficiary and would retain sole international rights to every Super Disc game, giving them a large degree of control in this partnership. They would also be the sole benefactor of licensing related to music and film software, so a massive chunk of any potential profits would go to Sony. Nintendo were very fearful of this, and they wanted to protect their status in the market, and would look to broker a deal with Sony's rivals in the electronics industry, Philips. This deal would have seen Nintendo take control of all their licenses on a Philips produced machine. As a result, Nintendo broke all ties to the Sony deal, including a planned presentation to showcase the Nintendo PlayStation at CES 1991. Incensed at Nintendo's betrayal, Ken Kutaragi decided that Sony would go solo and create their own console. Since Sony had no experience in game development, it had to rely on the support of third-party game developers. Unlike Sega and Nintendo, who both had a versatile and well-equipped array of in-house software divisions for their arcade games which could easily be ported successfully to their home consoles, Sony had discovered that many game creators were not fans of Nintendo's practices and were much in favor of working with Sony. Through several negotiations, Sony were able to get the support of big-name developers like Namco and Konami, as well as over 250 other development teams in Japan alone. This was gradually helping to turn the tide in Sony's favour, but Sony still had no developers of their own around the time the PlayStation was in development, so they acquired a UK-based Liverpool company, Psygnosis, which was later renamed SCE Liverpool, for $48 million. Securing their first in-house development team. The acquisition meant that Sony could have more launch games ready for the PlayStation's release in Europe and in North America. On December 3rd, 1994, the Sony PlayStation was officially released to the Japanese public to the sum of 39,800 yen, and it sold over 100,000 units on the first day, and over 2 million units within the first 6 months of its release. It would later get released in North America on the 9th of September 1995, and then 20 days later on the 29th of September to European audiences. Another little side note. Tom Kalinske, who was the head of Sega of America and the mastermind behind the success of the Sega Mega Drive, had looked to partner with Sony as 3D technology with silicon graphics was the new frontier. He took it to his boss in Japan, who promptly rejected it in favour of creating their own system on the Sega Saturn. Given the Saturn's eventual failure along with its successor the Dreamcast, Sega of Japan would have been better off listening to Tom Kalinske. And how different would the gaming landscape be if Sega had teamed with Sony and created the PlayStation? There would have been the issue of splitting the profits, but would all of Sony's individual successes with the PlayStation consoles have been Sega's successors too, with Sega have never left the hardware business to just become a software developer. I think it's fair to say that we would not have seen both Sonic and Mario together on the same console as we saw on the Nintendo Wii. This is one of life's biggest what-if stories. Over its entire lifespan, the PlayStation would go on to sell 102.49 units worldwide and become the 6th highest grossing video game console of all time. It paved the way for its predecessor, the PlayStation 2, which in itself would go on to become the #1 highest selling video game console of all time. The arrival of the PlayStation saw a new competitor break into the gaming market and break up the duopoly of Sega and Nintendo. And over time, Sony has become the largest video game company in the world with Sony Interactive Entertainment. 1994 really did see a paradigm shift with the emergence of Sony and the PlayStation. Super Street Fighter 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. The granddaddy of fighting games, Street Fighter 2 had taken the world by storm since it released in 1991. As was the way of Capcom in those days, there were several versions of the same game that were released. 1994 saw dual releases of what would be the final iteration of the Street Fighter 2 series. Super Street Fighter 2 was released on the Sega Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo in Japan on June 25th, 1994, and then on July 18th, 1994 in North America, and then August 17th in Australia, New Zealand, and then finally on December 2nd, 1994 in Europe. The game had all original 12 World Warriors from Street Fighter 2, including the 4 main Shadowloo bosses. And there was the addition of 4 brand new Street Fighter characters: Cammy, DJ, T-Hawk, and Fei Long. My 2 favorites from this were Fei Long and Cammy. Their additions to the game gave Street Fighter a whole new dimension and extra longevity play-wise. It also saw a very big aesthetic change to the game from the voiceover point of view, as each character no longer had the standard voices you heard from Street Fighter 2 and are now each more individualistic with their own voices. The gameplay now features a new scoring system, tracking combos, first attacks, reversals, and recoveries made by the players. Each character has 8 different color schemes which switch up the standard look for the characters in their original fighting gear. Speed wise, the game is not as fast as Street Fighter 2 Turbo, a feature that would be brought into the follow-up Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which basically took everything from Super Street Fighter 2 and added some more features. The speed being the obvious new add-in, and the addition of another character who'd go on to gain iconic status in the Street Fighter genre. I am of course referring to Akuma, who first appears in the last fight against Bison, in which he takes out Bison and you end up facing him as the final boss. His moveset is very similar to Ken and Ryu's, which made it an instant win for me personally. He's super quick and powerful with excellent combos. This was the beginning of a character who'd go on to become a massive fan favourite in Street Fighter lore. In my humble opinion, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is the best version of the Street Fighter 2 series as a whole. Each character feels unique in their own right now, more so than in the previous Street Fighter 2 versions. The speed of the game improves on Super Street Fighter 2 with faster hitting combos and attacks. The addition of Akuma is a massive bonus, making him the 5th brand new character to join Street Fighter from the Super series. Just overall, Super Street Fighter 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo are excellent additions to what at that point was a legendary franchise in the making. And fast forward over 30 years later with all the Street Fighter games that have come along ever since, I think we can all agree, the Street Fighter franchise is simply iconic. 1994 saw the release of a legendary side-scrolling platformer, Donkey Kong Country. It is a reboot of the Donkey Kong franchise, and it follows the gorilla Donkey Kong and his nephew Diddy Kong as they set out to recover their stolen banana hoard from the Crocodile King rule and his army, the Kremlings. The game has 2 main modes with single or multiplayer. The single player mode takes the gamer through 40 side-scrolling levels as they jump between platforms whilst avoiding obstacles. The player will collect items, ride minecarts and animals, defeat enemies and bosses, and find secret bonus stages. In multiple modes, 2 players work cooperatively or they race against each other. Now yes, I got all that information from online. Donkey Kong Country, whilst I played it a small handful of times growing up, it wasn't one of those games that stuck with me. I do see it around and it's not really a bad game at all, far from it. I just actually didn't play it until a few years after its release. and it is a fun game to play. I just never found the aptitude to sit down and play it through to its end. Donkey Kong Country helped re-establish Donkey Kong as a popular Nintendo franchise and is credited for helping Nintendo win the console war of the 1990s and maintaining the SNES's popularity into the 5th generation of video game consoles. The makers of the game Rare drew inspiration from the Super Mario Bros. Series, with Mario 3 being the primary influence for its level design. The game received critical acclaim from some of the top gaming publications in the 90s. It also set the record for the fastest selling video game at the time, selling over 500,000 copies within a week, and sales reached 1 million copies in the US alone in just 2 weeks. In the UK, it was the top selling SNES game in November 1994. Donkey Kong Country sold 6 million copies worldwide in its first holiday season, grossing $400 million in worldwide sales revenue. Cumulative sales reached 9.3 million copies. Donkey Kong Country is the 3rd best-selling Super Nintendo game of all time, just behind Super Mario World and Mario All-Stars. And it's also the best-selling Donkey Kong game of all time. Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Sonic the Hedgehog was running amok in the 1990s since making his debut with the very successful Sonic the Hedgehog on the SEGA Mega Drive. Here he was again in his 3rd outing, which was actually the first of 2 games he appeared in during 1994. A little more on that later. Like previous Sonic games, players guide Sonic and Tails through 6 zoned side-scrolling levels whilst collecting rings and defeating enemies as they attempt to retrieve the Chaos Emeralds and stop Dr. Robotnik from relaunching his space station, the Death Egg, after it crash lands on a mysterious floating island. Sonic 3 also saw the introduction of Knuckles the Echidna, the island guardian who is tricked by Robotnik into believing Sonic is the enemy trying to steal the Chaos Emeralds. Knuckles ends up laying traps for Sonic and Tails. I did play this game and I kept thinking surely Knuckles will become a playable character, as I had already seen clips of Knuckles in action in this game's follow-up. And again, more on that later. There are 7 Chaos Emeralds to collect, and collecting all of them unlocks Super Sonic, who is invincible to most obstacles. Sonic 3 has 2 types of special stages. The first involves bouncing up a gumball machine-like corridor to earn power-ups by hitting a switch. This is made possible after the player collects at least 50 rings and passes a checkpoint, which see them warp to the first special stage. The second special stage involves running around a 3D map and passing through all of a number of blue spheres arranging in patterns. My experience playing the game, as it's been years, was one of frustration but enjoyment, and I finally managed to clock the game as it took many deaths and chucking away my joypad before I finally got the job done. I like the inclusion of Tails as a fully playable character. Knuckles can be selected as a playable character in the competitive mode by racing through 1 or all 5 stages that do not appear in the main game. Robotnik as a boss is as tricky as ever, just like in the previous games. When compared to all the Sonic games, Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for me remains the best, but this I would put maybe a joint second with part 1, as I do like the inclusion of Tails. Sonic and Knuckles. As I was saying earlier, more on Sonic 3 later, so here we are. Sonic 3 not being the only release this year, Sonic and Knuckles was also released 8 months later on October 18th. Sonic 3 and Sonic Knuckles were originally planned as a single game according to designer Takashi Iizuka. The team really wanted to hit a home run with larger sales that took longer to develop, as ROM cartridges were too small to contain the game, and Sega wanted it released in time for a promotional deal with McDonald's in the US. So Sonic 3 was split into 2, with Sonic and Knuckles the second part. The game also produced a very noticeable feature: lock technology. This basically allowed players to open the hatch on the cartridge and insert a second cartridge. When Sonic 3 is inserted, the player can play it through both games as one. There are some noticeable changes to the game in this situation, like the layouts to the levels being altered, the ability to play through Sonic 3 levels as Knuckles or Sonic and Knuckles levels as Tails, and the ability to save progress in Sonic and Knuckles levels. Try saying that 3 times fast. There is also the Super Emeralds, which are earned by accessing special stages in the Sonic and Knuckles levels after collecting all 7 Chaos Emeralds from Sonic 3. However, this can be only done by combining the cartridges via the lock cartridge. Now, I won't go into the entire plot of the game, as that can be said for a later video, but as far as the gameplay goes, as it was originally supposed to be a single player game, it plays identical to Sonic 3. Both games games are 2D side-scrolling platformers with similar level designs, graphics and mechanics. However, in Sonic & Knuckles, the player chooses either Sonic or Knuckles. Also, the player cannot control two characters together. There is also no multiplayer mode or save feature. You go through all 6 levels as either Sonic or Knuckles and can become super versions of them, provided you collect these 7 Chaos Emeralds. Knuckles becomes one of the heroes in this game when he discovers that he was duped by Robotnik, and in his story he takes on Mecha Sonic as his own boss. As far as the overall rankings go in Sonic lore for these two games, excellent follow-ups to the first 2 Sonic games, a great introduction to a new character in Knuckles, but not as great as Sonic 2 in my opinion, but still, it's an enjoyable game. Super Metroid, the action-adventure game which was the 3rd installment of the Metroid series. Following the events of the Game Boy game Metroid 2 Return of Samus in 1991, this one focuses on exploration with the player searching for power-ups used to reach previously inaccessible areas. It introduced new concepts to the series such as the inventory screen, an auto map and the ability to fire in all directions. The makers of the previous Metroid games returned for this game, and it took over 2 years to develop. The game was praised for its atmosphere, gameplay, music and graphics, and it's often cited as one of the greatest video games of all time. Super Metroid was the 9th best-selling video game of 1994 with over 531,000 copies sold that year in Japan. Over the course of its life cycle, the game went on to sell a worldwide total of 1.42 million copies. The game also received several awards and was given several high ratings to various publications. There was also some criticism. Bruce McLaughlin of IGN said the Super Metroid still fell down on the timing, arriving too late in the SNES cycle to earn any big sales. He may have had a point as the game ranks in as 34 in the all-time Super Nintendo games chart. Now, as critically lauded as this game is, it is not one of the games that I played much at all during the heyday of the SNES, but it does stand out as one of the best games ever made for the system. Doom 2, the follow-up to the highly successful and game-changing first-person shooter Doom. Doom 2 features large levels, new enemies, a new super shotgun weapon, and a new power-up. Doom 2 was not dramatically different from its predecessor, and there were no major technological developments, graphical improvements, or substantial gameplay changes. There were larger non-linear levels as the new engine allowed for larger and more intricate levels to be made. Each level is infested with demons that can be killed with a variety of weapons found throughout the game. Levels are completed by finding an exit, whether it be a switch or a teleporter. The goal is simply to advance to the next area. The game is not quite as straightforward linear as the original, and as a result, players can wander, roam the path and find items such as health pickups and weapons. There are over 32 levels, 2 of which are secret levels that can be accessed from level 15. Critically, Doom received many positive reviews from top gaming publications like MacUser, Metacritic, AllGame, GameSpy, and GameSpot. The game sold 1.81 million units and earned over $74.7 million in revenue in the US alone. It refined everything that made the original Doom an excellent game, and in the process, you had a very worthy sequel. Ending the video game section is the SNES game Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the video game. The Power Rangers were already leaving their imprint on pop culture with their now iconic TV series. Like every major brand, there will always be branch outs to other areas to broaden their appeal, and Power Rangers was no different. And in 1994, we saw Power Rangers the video game released to all major platforms including the Super Nintendo, the Sega Mega Drive, the Game Gear, and the Game Boy. The game is a side-scrolling action game composed of 7 stages. It plays similar to Streets of Rage or Ninja Turtles in Time. You select one of the 5 OG Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and go through each level battling enemies and then morph in between and continue fighting the putties until you come across the first end of level boss. As you progress through the game, the enemies will get harder and harder until you get a final showdown with Rita Repulsa. Very basic and straightforward with not much in terms of storytelling or outstanding gameplay. As far as classic games go, this is not one of them. Critics considered it too easy for veteran game players. I didn't actually play the game until well into my adulthood, and after giving it a try, it's very bland and it's nothing special. It can be a little guilty pleasure every now and then, but after a while, it just gets boring. This was just to capitalize on the massive popularity of the Power Rangers. There's nothing I can add to it except that it was a game that capitalized on the success of the TV show and not a whole lot more. Thankfully, there are much better Power Ranger video games out there like Mega Battle and Battle for the Grid. There was a massive array of video games that were released this year, but to get through each and every one, well, will just take forever. So I just highlighted those that stood out from my perspective. Now here's a quick little montage from the other releases from this year. That was all she wrote on the gaming section for 1994, but it's still not over yet, as we end 1994 by checking out some of the most memorable TV shows to make their debuts. Tune in next time for the fourth and final episode of...
It was the year 1994.